So, the enviable life. Now, I don't know if that's how you would describe kingdom life. You may put other words there. I do know there are many, many people in this world who, if you talk to them about living a Christian life, they would describe it in other words. Dull, dreary, difficult, uninteresting. We say it is the enviable life. And in these rapid fire statements by Jesus, let's see how this works. There we go. Yes, in these rapid fire statements by Jesus, we're introduced to it. One, bang, 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 bang. So what we're going to do this morning, we're going to look at those statements. But before we do, we need to say one or two things about them in general. Three things that apply to each of them. The first is this, that all three are totally, absolutely countercultural. Countercultural? Well, it means it goes against the grain. It's not the way people live. It's not the things that people normally do. And because it's countercultural, people have responded in different ways. Some Christians have said, well, they're a kind of provision for the end times, something to be put into place in those days of kind of emergency before the second coming. Others have dismissed them as totally impractical. For me, God's speaking about how I need to live here today. The second thing to say is this, that they're not only countercultural, but they are deeply personal. You know, we're not talking about something that's cosmetic, something to do with your behavior, something to do with what you should wear and how you should look when you go to church, but we're talking about something that gets right inside and has as much to do with all this stuff in here as it does with that outside and how we behave and relate and conduct ourselves there. And the third thing to say is this, that they each bring a unique blessing. It is tempting to say the blessing is happiness, but I think it's actually more than that, you see, because what Jesus is talking about is not something that's subjective, which is always dependent upon how I feel and my particular mood when I get up and whether I ate cheese to go to bed last night. It is something far more objective than that. It is God smiling on us. It is a sense of God being with us. It is the assurance that we're in his care and in his keeping. Now, that doesn't mean that every day it'll be plain sailing. That doesn't mean that every day I'll be on cloud 9. But it does mean that I will be blessed. So let's start. The poor in spirit. If you met someone coming down the road with a long face, your inclination may be say, what on earth's wrong? Cheer up. Poor in spirit, that they are blessed. Well, there it is. Because you see, the kingdom is not for those who know how rich they are. The kingdom is, in essence, for those who know their poverty. For those who, in the words of the old hymn, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. The kingdom is for those kind of people. People who know their poverty. People who know that without God's help, they have nothing, absolutely nothing. And of course it was to the poor that Jesus addressed his message. Remember that day in Nazareth when Jesus began his public ministry and he went to worship and they handed him the scroll and Jesus read from Isaiah 61 and he picked on what passage? He picked on the passage that talked about being anointed to preach the good news to the poor. Well, obviously some of the poor were people who were materially poor, who hadn't got a big balance. But the poor were also those, who knew their poverty. And who, perhaps like Matthew, for example, was well-to-do in riches, but knew also that inner poverty. that was the people for whom the kingdom was intended. Now that's something we need just to bear in mind. And we need to remember that Jesus said a very serious warning, addressed it to the church at Laodicea. When my wife and I went on a tour of the 7 churches, some of them had quite splendid sites. But the church at Laodicea, that it was still these ruins that the Turkish government hadn't yet arranged as a nice kind of memorial to the past. It was just these scattered remains. And perhaps that in itself was a kind of warning to a church that thought itself to be rich and self-sufficient. Jesus, said, no, you're really so poor, so poor. And that isn't just a warning to individuals, that's a warning to every Christian fellowship. That's a warning to every community that calls itself Christian. And what about the mourners? Well, clearly, Jesus is not thinking about the people who are bereaved. Yes, he comforts them. Yes, he brings his hope and his assurance to them. Earlier this week, when I was visiting somebody who had been bereaved, it was part of my job to try and convey something of the hope and the assurance that is in Jesus. But when Jesus talked about the mourners, he wasn't thinking about those who are grieving over a loved one. Jesus was thinking about something else. He was thinking about those who grieve over their sins. He was thinking about those who, knowing their condition, their poverty, are prepared to grieve over their condition, their sins, their wrongdoing. Now, this is an invitation to create a kind of guilt complex that we're going to carry around week after week, year after year. But it is just need to recognize that we do need to weep over our condition. But it doesn't stop there. Because I believe that the comfort that Jesus brings when we're in that kind of condition, the comfort that Jesus brings is his own complete, total, absolute forgiveness. And it's perhaps then, when we've known that we can start mourning for those in need. That's the reference in Psalm 119, verse 136. You may never have got as far as that in Psalm 119 because of its length, but it's there. Mourning about the consequences of what evil has done and how it's broken and destroyed and corrupted men's lives. You want an exercise, just a matter of interest. When you've got a spare time, just think about all the people who have mourned over others. I'll give you a few names as starters. You can think of William Carey, who mourned over those who didn't know the gospel. You can think of some of the great social reformers like Wilberforce and others who mourned over slavery. You can think of Bernardo, who mourned over small children. And it wasn't just sentiment. It wasn't just saying how sorry I am, how concerned I am. It was a mourning that made them into active world changers, life changers. And so we move on. The meek. What does meekness suggest to you? What does it suggest? Well, I tell you, the Greek means gentle, humble, considerate, courteous. And if it's all that, then it really must mean self-control, and that's the real rub, isn't it? It isn't just thinking that we are nice and meek. It is the self-control that allows us to demonstrate that. You see, so that it's all very well when we think about ourselves, our hearts. That's what it has to do with. It's all very well when we think about ourselves. We can, congratulate us. But what about others? What about others? Because we don't live on our own. What about 2:30 last Tuesday afternoon when another motorist got impatient with me in the hospital car park? What about Thursday afternoon at about 5 o'clock when somebody in the queue, the checkout queue at the supermarket, was clearly trying to hassle me? What about then? How meek do I feel then? Well, you are going to answer that for yourselves, aren't you? Because you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. And you don't have to be a driver, and you don't have to shop at a supermarket, but you know it happens to you as well. And then there's that promise there in Psalm 37. The meek inheriting the earth. And you say to it, can it ever be? And here's Jesus picking that up from the Old Testament scriptures as he so often did and planting it onto the people of his kingdom, the people who are living this kind of life. It's a bit breathtaking, isn't it? It is a bit kind of overwhelming. And the hungry. Well, of course, we've all had a good breakfast this morning. Well, I expect most of us have. But remember the song that Mary sung? She'd been told that she was going to be the person who was going to bear this very special person who's going to come into the world. And in her song, she sang, he has filled the hungry. Fill the hungry. The others he sent empty away, but he's filled the hungry. And in a way, that kind of anticipates all that Jesus was going to do and all that the kingdom was going to bring when Jesus came to initiate it. Yeah. Righteousness. The hungry are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Now, there are different kinds of righteousness. There's a legal righteousness. That's justification, and those were kind of concepts that Paul was drawing on, especially in Romans, when he talked about us being justified, being declared innocent in God's presence because of Jesus. When we're justified, people in a right relationship with God. And later on in Ephesians, Paul said that we were to wear that like a breastplate, covering all our vital organs. Put on righteousness. Interesting, it's a breastplate. You see, we're supposed to be facing the enemy, not running away from him, because then we really are vulnerable. And social righteousness. And that's all the concern of the law and the prophets. And again, that has a bit of a tie-up with what I was saying about the mourners, doesn't it? About the people, who had that heart to want to change things. Or Damien Miller in Mozambique, setting up a project for justice for people in that country, in the name of Christ, and as an agent of the church. And another kind of righteousness is the moral righteousness, the righteousness of character, the righteousness of who we are. And for this we really need a spiritual appetite. I hope when you go home at lunchtime you'll have an appetite for your meal. But what about an appetite for spiritual things? What about an appetite to say, God's been good to me. I rejoice that I am where I am. But I don't want to get stuck here. I don't want to get fixed here. I don't want to get, here, as it were, as a permanency. I want to be moving on. I want to discover more about you, Lord. I want to discover more of your truth, and I want to let your truth have a bigger and greater and a growing impact in my own life. We need a hunger. We need a real hunger for that, to be moving on and to be progressing and to be developing. Paul, when he was in when he was writing to the Philippians, more than likely from prison, he says, I haven't reached things. I just want to keep on reaching forward because I haven't got there yet. Reaching forward. And then, blessed are the merciful. It's not a word we often hear today, is it? Mercy is a kind of, I suppose to my ears, it's a bit Victorian. It's a bit, in the past. Well, let's see what it really means. The merciful people are essentially people who are compassionate. People whose concern, whose world is so much bigger than their own. There's people whose hearts go out in compassion to others, in concern to others. And if you notice, it's all a continuity here, isn't it? Because it's all approaching the same way of relating to others, but saying it in different words. The merciful are essentially people who are compassionate. That's a very good word for that. Very good word. But another word for the merciful is, and there's a reference, I forgot to say that, to the story of the Good Samaritan, and how Jesus depicted the different people who came to look at this guy lying on the roadside, and one of them kind of, and kept his distance. Another went to have a real look. It was almost a clinical inspection, but he didn't do anything until finally the Samaritan came. But the merciful are also the forgiving. They're the people who don't store up in their hearts the stuff, the hurts, the pains, the bitterness that they experience. The merciful are the people who can end the day without going to bed angry at what someone has done to them. Interesting, isn't it, that when Peter asked in this passage in Matthew 18, when Peter asked, how often am I to forgive someone who's done wrong? 7. And I suspect he was thinking, I'm going to get top marks for that answer. Jesus said, no, 7 times 7, 70 times 7. And that doesn't mean that you do the maths, and when you get to 490 and 91, you can... But it does mean that when you've been deeply and profoundly hurt, you need to keep on revisiting that, and forgiving, and forgiving, and forgiving. And I say that as somebody who took me nearly 6 years to forgive someone who had profoundly and deeply hurt me. It will come, and if you ask me how do you know, I'll tell you. You'll be able to remember the incident and not feel angry, and not feel resentful, and not feel you want to get your own back. It's there. The merciful. Then Jesus goes on to talk about the pure. Remember the question that Psalm 24 asks about coming into God's presence? He has clean hands and a pure heart. We're very quick usually to focus on the exterior, but it is from the interior that the exterior comes. It's from the pure heart that the clean hands come. It's from what we are on the inside that we're able to do the right deeds, the proper deeds, the correct deeds. And it's very tempting to get it the other way around and to forget this appropriate sequel, one following the other. So it isn't a question of having the right dress and observing the right patterns of behavior. It isn't anything to do with that. It is far rather asking, as David did after his adultery with Bathsheba, for a pure heart. Pure heart. Give me a pure heart. A heart that can be held up to the light so that it can shine through it without any kind of darkness. And it's from a pure heart that pure deeds come. It's from what people are on the inside that the deeds of their life come. And so we come to peacemakers. And as Andy reminded us in our praying, and as we all know from the news, we live in a world that seems to desperately, desperately need peacemakers. In a world where there's so much conflict, where there's so much antagonism. But Jesus was the peacemaker of all time. Let's start by saying that. He was the peacemaker. Why? Because he and he alone made peace, the essential peace, the crucial peace between the human race and the Father. It was he who brought peace. And that's basic, that's fundamental. That's something that we all need. He was the peacemaker. And that reference in Colossians 1 just underlines that point. And as peacemakers, you and I are committed to that ministry of reconciliation of which Paul talked about. Now, it sounds nice in church on Sunday morning at 22 minutes past 10, but when you're actually out there, and if you've ever been involved, for example, in trying to reconcile two friends who've fallen out, and you're in the middle, you know at the end of the day, whatever you say, you're not going to end up being liked by either of them. You know, to put yourself in that position of trying to bring them together and say, hi guys, let's see if we can sort this. It is a position, a role that seldom, if ever, brings real liking and real congratulation. You know, people, they spark up. Oh, you're his friend. You're taking his side. And you find yourself in those kind of situations. I think it's something that Jesus called us to nonetheless, to be peacemakers. Now what's the next one? But in essence, again, one of the great ways to make peace is evangelism. It is to bring people together and to lead them into a totally new relationship with the Father. That's something really significant. And when we do that, we've dealt with the very basic estrangement that human beings know. So the persecuted. Blessed are the persecuted, for they will be given a very special blessing, the persecuted. Now, let's be quite clear about this, that we're persecuted because of Jesus. Not because we're awkward, not because we're difficult, not because in the office people, the newcomers are told, oh, just watch so-and-so. Not because on the shop floor we're known to be stirrers. I knew a man who, when he went out on the works offering, was given a present of a wooden spoon. He was always stirring it. Now, we are to be persecuted not because of that, but because we stand for Jesus. And because our allegiance to him is a known allegiance. How did Jesus expect his disciples to react under persecution? How was I supposed to react in the car park this week and in the supermarket? Well, there you are. Rejoice and be glad. Now that isn't always very easy, I have to say. That isn't always very easy. But the thing we need to remember, every time that this has a reward, and this is all for his sake. We're persecuted for his sake, and we're rewarded for his sake. And it is because Jesus is our Lord and our Saviour that the blessings come. Well now, that agenda is a pretty big agenda, isn't it? It's pretty detailed, and it reaches out and pokes into all kinds of areas in our lives. But we can't leave this passage without just remembering that right off at the end, Jesus kind of tailed it off by saying that people in his kingdom are both salt and light. And that's part of our Christian calling, to be salt and light. Not just one, but both, simultaneously. To be salt, preserving the total decay of our society. To be salt, calling our world to things that they have forgotten or overlooked or neglected. To be salt, reminding them of stuff that they've forgotten. And to be light. This world is a very dark place, and we need the light to shine. One of my heroes is Andrew. That is a sign of my old age, I've forgotten his surname. The man who is the vicar of the church in Baghdad, Andrew White, that's his name. And so he's a guy on his own. But there amidst all the awfulness and the darkness, shining like a light. You will have your own. And I don't ask you to agree with me, I'm just telling you something very personal. So there we are. The Beatitudes are a challenge to leave the ways of this world. An invitation to taste the new life of the kingdom and to be transformed by the power and mercy of God. For some of you it will be an invitation. For some it may be something you've never actually done before, deliberately. Saying, I'm up for this. This is where I'm going. For some of you, it may be taking you further into the kingdom, into areas that you hadn't really thought about before. And for all who turn to Jesus, the promise of being transformed, being renewed, being made afresh in his likeness. Let's pray.